Welcome to another edition of the Official Jets podcast powered by Amazon Web Services. Today's episode, EA and I catch up with Matt Miller of Bleacher Report, their lead draft expert, and draft coverage really ramping up here. EA, what did you think about the interview with Matt Miller? What stood out to you before we dive into it here?
So many things. I thought it was interesting, his take on the running backs, because sure, we've been focused on wide receivers and tackles and cornerbacks and edges, and rightfully so, because those are clear Jets needs. But you also have to think about positions where you need increased depth. And Le'Veon Bell, the star running back, still one of the better players in the league, will be back next year. And I think I'm looking forward to seeing him play behind a revamped offensive line, Greens. But listen, you got Bilal Powell and Ty Montgomery, unrestricted free agents. So who are the guys going to be lining up behind him? And Matt, during his evaluations, the further he went along and looked at tape and talked to people throughout the league, is that there are a lot of guys with valuable skill sets who would provide teams with great complementary options out of the backfield.
Matt Miller talked about a couple of them, one that he pegged to the Jets in his 7-round mock draft. Without further ado, here's the one-on-one with Matt Miller. First things first, how are you health-wise, and how has this whole pandemic changed, if at all, your day-to-day basis at this time of year?
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. As I've told you before, I live in the middle of nowhere, which is probably the first time in my life I'm very fortunate to live in the middle of nowhere. So, I'm taking this as seriously as everyone else, limiting my contact with other people, not, sitting at the bar every night, drinking beers, talking to my friends, being very mindful of who I come in contact with, begging my parents to stay home. Like, what a switch now, trying to tell mom and dad to stay home and use the senior citizen hours at the grocery store. But no, I'm good. I live in an area where we thankfully haven't seen the numbers rise as of yet, but definitely keeping everyone up there. You guys know I've spent a lot of time in New York over the last decade working for Bleacher Report. Have a lot of friends up there, including yourselves and people in that building. So definitely wishing the best for everybody up in the New York area.
And Matt, so for people who don't know, where in the Midwest are you at?
Man, I'm in Joplin, Missouri. So if you, I tell people, if you watch Ozark and Tiger King on Netflix, I'm right in the middle.
Yes.
I'm right in the middle of those two shows. And it's like, that's where I live. Those are the people I interact with every day. Tiger King and Jason Bateman. So I'm in a community of like 150,000 people, and we have yet to see Missouri as a state, do the statewide shutdown. But I do live in an area where the city leaders have stepped in a couple weeks ago and shut things down. And honestly, Bleacher Report did very early. They told us, it feels like it was 4 months ago. At this point, it was probably 3 weeks, that they didn't want us traveling. They wanted us to take this seriously. And so, again, very fortunate to have, to be surrounded by smart people who are making good decisions.
You have a lot of contacts throughout the National Football League. How is this impacting the scouting process here in April? We're three weeks away from the 2020 NFL draft, and this will be the most unprecedented draft I can remember.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. I've talked to players about that, even like, you guys are going through something that no one's ever gone through before. So, try to be mindful of that. When you talk to scouts, agents, coaches, general managers, it's funny because you'll get differing opinions. I've talked to some guys who, they're enjoying the time with their family that they normally wouldn't get this time of year. You're actually being at home instead of at the facility 24/7. So there's a silver lining to it. Other guys are excited because I have one scout tell me we're actually going to draft football players, not track stars this year, because the tape that the guys put on the field for 3 or 4 years is what you're going to have to rely on instead of the private workouts, the pro days. This year we actually saw, I believe, a record number of players not perform at the combine because the schedule changed. So it's funny. That was such a topic a month ago. Like, no one's working out at the combine. Now, because there aren't private workouts, there aren't pro days, there are a lot of players where you don't have a full athletic profile on. T. Higgins from Clemson, right? Everyone expected this guy to be a first rounder. He doesn't work out at the combine. And his pro day was one of the last ones before everything was shut down by the National Football League. And so the number that's out there on him is a 4.56 in the 40-yard dash, which isn't terrible, but it's not great. He doesn't have a chance to do better than that. There are other players who, day three guys or small school players, this is really going to affect. One that stands out to me, Tyler Johnson from Minnesota, incredibly productive for 2 years for the Gophers at wide receiver, but opted out of the Shrine Game and then opted not to run or do agilities at the combine. So now you have a player that you haven't seen him do any athletic testing, didn't get a pro day in, can't do private workouts. Guys like that are unfortunately going to see a slide because of this.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because just keeping the receiver thing, just a couple guys stand out to me when you think of like Brian Edwards, didn't play in the Senior Bowl, then he broke his foot in training, Van Jefferson. But one guy that I wanted to ask you about, maybe just your evaluation and how this process has affected him. What about somebody at the tackle spot like Prince Tega Winogo, who's an intriguing prospect and has a great story, but not being able to participate in a lot of these things? Like, where is his evaluation at now, and just what kind of football player do you think he is?
Yeah, you almost have to put like an incomplete grade on some of these guys, which is not a good thing. That's not where you want to be. So like you said, amazing story. I know that initially they were very excited to get him at the Senior Bowl. And so I think the injury questions are for a player like Prince, that's going to hurt. So if you're talking about maybe he would have been like a round 2 or round 3 player to begin with, if you're not comfortable with the medicals and you weren't able to see a workout, that's when players I think are going to see a slide. Lucas Nying from TCU is another offensive tackle who's kind of in a similar boat where you have a history of some hip issues, and the fact that he wasn't able to participate in the pre-draft process before things were shut down, it leaves you wanting more information, and you're almost having to rely on third-party sources when it comes to medicals or outdated information, a year-end physical, or guys who are at the Senior Bowl. You're hoping they at least went through a physical process there so that you can get those medical records. But scouts and general managers are definitely scrambling. And so for those two offensive tackles particularly, they're players that I like. I don't have either ranked in my top 8 tackles right now because of just the question marks when it comes to where they're at from a health perspective.
We're certainly going to talk more about the tackles and receivers offensively. Also, the cornerbacks and the edges defensively, because those are 4 definite Jets needs. But hey, listen, you're doing a lot of film work. You just did your 7-round mock draft that probably took you a couple years to finish. I don't know how you're able to complete those. But one thing that you've been stressing, it's kind of been under the radar, is the depth of this running back group.
Yeah, it is. It's a good group, EA. And I think it's the difference between living on Twitter and living in a world where you talk to NFL decision makers, because you'll see, folks on Twitter either love or hate a class. Then you talk to people around the league. And I put a starting grade on 7 players. And then I put a high level contributor grade on 5 more. So you're at 12 to 13 running backs that I believe as rookies could be high level contributors. So it is a very good class. DeAndre Swift from Georgia at the top is my number 1 running back. Then you have Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin, who over 6,000 rushing yards, and 4.4 speed. Clyde Edwards-Helaire and J.K. Dobbins, 2 players that we saw, carry teams to the postseason and have big performances there. I'm still a believer in Cam Akers coming out of Florida State. I think he could be a starter in the NFL. I guarantee you he will never run behind a worse offensive line than he did at college. Zach Moss at Utah, he's a punishing, powerful guy. Keyshawn Vaughn at Vanderbilt, excellent receiver out of the backfield with some big play speed. So there are good running backs. And whether the Jets value that early with Le'Veon Bell coming back or not, it's still a good year to get a complimentary back or someone that you believe could be down the road could become a starter.
I'm very glad you mentioned that, because I've seen previous mock drafts of yours where you had Cam Akers to the Jets in the 3rd round. So what about Akers' game do you think could complement Le'Veon Bell well? And not only that, but in your 7-round mock draft that EA mentioned, you had them taking a running back in the 6th round in Eno Benjamin out of Arizona State.
Yeah, something those guys have in common is that they're both very good receivers out of the backfield. And I think Cam Akers, in a lot of ways, is a poor man's Le'Veon Bell. You want that outside zone runner who's going to be exceptional, on wheel routes, getting out to the flats, being a safety valve for the quarterback in the passing game. I love that about Cam Akers. And I think had he been at an LSU or Ohio State or Alabama, we would be talking much more about his production. Unfortunately, I of the running backs I've studied, no one had a worse offensive line than he did in 2018 and 2019. So with Akers, you're getting a really nice blend of vision, contact balance, and power with enough runaway speed where you get him on the outside, get him on the corner. He has that ability to make daylight runs where he's going to get to the open field and he's going to be able to get to the end zone. And with Eno Benjamin, he is a smaller guy who's not someone I would project to be a featured back that's going to, be your 20 touch carry guy. But as a complement to someone like Le'Veon Bell, Eno's going to give you a little bit more of a spark, a little bit more flash, but also just what he could bring to the table as a pass catcher. He's got to get better in pass protection. I think that's the biggest issue with Eno Benjamin. We saw the production, especially as a receiver in 2019, was fantastic, but he is not ready right now to stack up against blitzers in the NFL and be able to protect the Sam Darnold. So he's a little bit of a developmental guy, but does have some tools that I really like.
Do you think something's changing in the National Football League? For years, we talk about the left tackles being the emphasis, and then below them, the right tackles, where this year, when we think about these big four prospects who are almost assuredly going to all go in the first round, there's a couple of guys who they are projecting are going to be right tackles in 2020 and contribute right away.
Well, and two of those guys played right tackle. Tristan Wirfs at Iowa was a right tackle. Jedrick Wills at Alabama was a right tackle. Now they're both very athletic and I think could make that transition. But something you even see with Josh Jones out of Houston at the Senior Bowl, we saw him work a lot at right tackle. So I do think there's something to that of you just want to get your 5 best linemen on the field these days, because you have to worry about Von Miller coming off the right edge. You have to worry about Khalil Mack. You have to worry about the San Francisco 49ers rolling out Nick Bosa and Dee Ford. You have to worry about the Los Angeles Chargers with Melvin Ingram and Joey Bosa. So you can't handicap yourself like you used to, where, okay, we have to stop Lawrence Taylor and Derek Thomas. We have a good left tackle. It doesn't really matter what we do on the right side. But I think you can look at Lane Johnson in Philadelphia, Mitchell Schwartz in Kansas City as guys who are, they're their best linemen on their roster, and they're very, very valuable in that spot. So as defenses get, more balanced in their pass rush, I think having a right tackle who, isn't a scrub, a guy who is an athlete and can stop the good pass rushers that you see is incredibly important, because this isn't rocket science, right? If you have a bad right tackle, guess where I'm putting my best pass rusher? I'm going to figure out a way to put my best guy over there. And especially, in the AFC East, we've seen the Dolphins spend a lot of money on pass rushers. The Patriots, they're always going to be able to get after the quarterback, and the Bills have some young guys there. So you have to be able to be left and right handed to protect your quarterback.
Jedrick Wills, I believe, I don't know if it's changed since, but last time I checked in with you, he was your first offensive tackle, your highest graded guy. You recently had him on your podcast, Stick to Football. Just a couple things. One, what's something that you kind of took away from that interview? Like, what's something fans don't know about him? And do you think a team like the Browns, who are one pick ahead of the Jets, they're also likely to address tackle, whether that's at 10 or later on in the draft, to be determined? But if they are at 10 and they just signed Jack Conklin, do you think that would almost prohibit them from taking somebody like Jedrick Wills or Tristan Wirfs, who's more of a projection on the left side, as opposed to Mekhi Becton or Andrew Thomas?
Yeah, they're a tough team to figure out, the Cleveland Browns are, because they don't ever have anyone there long enough for us to study the trends, right? So it's really hard to say, okay, this is what they like in a player. This is what they're looking for. That's definitely an interesting part of this. They need a left tackle. They don't need someone who, Jack Conklin's going to start at right tackle and be a high level player there. So I think with the Browns specifically, that could lean you more towards a Mekhi Becton. I think one thing that I learned talking to Jedrick Wills, and I've talked to Tristan Wirfs, not on my podcast, but I've talked to him separately. Both guys are two fantastic athletes, and not just 40-yard speed. They're very good short area agility, quickness. They both have good length. And so all the boxes that you would traditionally check for a guy to play left tackle, they both hit that. And we asked Jedrick Wills, hey, if Tua Tagovailoa had been right-handed, would you have played left tackle? And he really said, I'm comfortable playing wherever. That's where they asked me to play. Alex Leatherwood, Alabama's left tackle, is a pretty good player in his own right. But I've seen Wirfs and Wills play enough to feel pretty confident they could play on the left side, whether that's in Cleveland or in New York or, the Arizona Cardinals, whoever ends up drafting one of those guys in the top 10 or 11 picks.
If you're the Jets at 11, you have to trust your board, and that's what Joe Douglas is going to do. There's no doubt about that. But when you're ranking these guys, and we're a couple of weeks away on the Matt Miller big board, do you have those 4 tackles really close together? Because there is a need for the Jets. I always tell Greens, yes, you go best player available, but need breaks the tie. And also, where do you see the drop off where you say, well, maybe, I want to protect Sam Darnold, but I got to give him a playmaker too. and I love one of these receivers.
No, you're right, man. I always say that best player available is actually one of the biggest lies in the NFL because you're going to put your needs at the top, right? So it's the best available out of need. It's amazing that every general manager still rolls that out. Like, oh yeah, he was the best player on our board. Most cases, it was the best player out of need. So I do think that, with the Jets, I have those tackles ranked very closely together. I have Jedrick Wills first, Tristan Wirfs second, Mekhi Becton third, and then Andrew Thomas fourth. And not far behind them, I have Josh Jones from Houston and Austin Jackson from USC. So I do expect 6 tackles to be drafted in the first round this year. With the Jets, I feel like at 11, they're in a really good position to not have to use those 2 second-round picks to trade up and get a tackle. The best thing for the New York Jets would be for quarterbacks to go early. Yep. You want 4 quarterbacks going in the top 10s because that's going to push more good offensive tackles down to where you guys are drafting at 11. So I think, again, they're in a good spot where I don't feel like this is a year where we're going to see another defender in the first round, even though there's some good players out there at edge rusher and at corner. If one of the tackles isn't there, if you don't like the tackles, that just means more receivers are available. And in most mock drafts that I do right now, all the receivers are still on the board at 11 because we're not expecting, the Cardinals trade for Nuke Hopkins. They don't need a receiver anymore. We're not expecting the Carolina Panthers to take one. We're not really expecting the Jacksonville Jaguars to take one. So the Jets end up in a position where you might be looking at the second best offensive tackle and the best wide receiver, which that's where it comes down to what you were talking about, EA. It's the best player at a position of need. And in my opinion, and I believe Joe Douglas feels this way too, a left tackle is a lot more important than a wide receiver, and they're a lot harder to find. The best offensive tackles in the NFL right now were first-round picks. So it's really a position where you have to spend that premium pick. At wide receiver, we've all called this a historic receiver class. There's going to be good players to be had in the 40s when the Jets come back on the clock.
Well, to your point right there, who do you like at 48 when the Jets are back on the clock? Obviously, it depends to everybody who potentially like the Minnesota Vikings take to replace Stephon Diggs.
Right.
But who's a guy that, unrelated to whether you think they'll be there or not, who do you like more than others?
Yeah, I'm a fan of Denzel Mims from Baylor. He's incredibly raw, but he's athletic as heck and he's big and he can run. So I like Denzel Mims. I still really like Michael Pittman from USC. So just get that Trojan connection going with Sam Darnold. I watched this guy. It was the night before the Wisconsin-Michigan game. I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm at a bar with my guys from Stick to Football, and I'm watching Michael Pittman destroy Utah. And that Utah defense is going to have like 8 players drafted, and Pittman's just going off. And he's not the fastest guy, but in some ways reminds me of Michael Thomas with how physical he is in his route running, that he creates separation just by being physical and by being precise with his route. So I'm a fan of Michael Pittman. If he's there at 48, I would be jumping all over that because I do think, we're going to see a tier of receivers where it's Michael Pittman and then some smaller guys like a Jalen Reagor from TCU, KJ Hamler from Penn State, who I had the Jets taking in my latest mock draft. The receivers that we expect to be there in round 2, there's not a lot of like big physical players, and Pittman would give Sam Darnold someone that is going to box out. He's going to be physical, on breaking routes, on slants. He's going to post up in the red zone, and we've seen him have production against NFL caliber corners. Not just that Utah game, a lot of what he did in the Pac-12 over the last 2 years.
NFL draft scout Matt Miller bringing the information as always. Okay, let me ask you about cornerback. We know Okudah, Ohio State. He could go in the top 5. He might be a likely number 3 selection if the Lions stay there. Who else should we be paying attention to down the line, whether that's round 1 or early in round 2? Because the Jets still do have a need on the outside. They brought back Brian Poole, key acquisition. They bring in Pierre Desir. Well, we don't know who's going to start opposite Desir. Now, what do you see in terms of this draft in maybe rounds 2, rounds 3, or even late 1?
Yeah, this corner class is interesting because there's Jeff Okudah, who's going to be, like you said, a top 5 pick. Then there's CJ Henderson, who's probably going to be a top 20 pick, somewhere between 9 and 17 is probably his floor. After that, there's a tier of corners that are very hard to separate. Jeff Gladney from TCU, 5'10", but incredibly sticky at the line of scrimmage. There's big guys like Christian Fulton from LSU, Jalen Johnson from Utah, AJ Terrell from Clemson, guys who we saw in the college football playoff, a couple of those. So then you get into the These guys are all 6 foot, 6'1", 6'2", can play on the outside. They're all 200 pounds. And then after that, I think there's another tier of players that are Trevon Diggs would probably be in that tier with those other big guys. But, then there's a break to the next group, and there's a lot more question marks with someone like Noah Igbenogany from Auburn, who's probably going to go around pick 50. So it's a good corner class in the top, I think, 64. After that, I see a pretty significant drop off. After that, you're getting into guys like a Bryce Hall from Virginia, who had 2 lower leg breaks this past season, 1 injury, but 2 broken bones. Gigantic question mark right now, because you're not able to bring him in to Florham Park and run him through the all the physicals that you want to do and get the X-rays and the MRIs. Can't do that. So I think someone like Bryce Hall, normally you would say it's a tremendous value in round 3. Right now, there would be a little more uncertainty around a player like that. So I'm with you. I think outside corner is a big need. If you don't go there in round 2, I would probably hang my hat on someone like Stanford Samuels from Florida State in round 3. Cameron Dantzler from Mississippi State would be another player that I believe they have the size to hold up on the outside in a Greg Williams defense.
Matt, before we let you go, just real quick, the Jets have 11, 48, 68, and 79. In Matt Miller's ideal scenario, how does that board fall out for the Jets' first 4 picks?
Yeah, ideal at 11, you're getting Jedrick Wills because he is my top tackle. I believe he would be that left tackle to protect Sam Darnold for the next 10 years. I think in the second round with those 2 picks, ideally, you're getting a receiver like a Michael Pittman, someone who can be your X receiver. He could be your number 1 guy, your go-to. I place a big emphasis on edge rusher in this defense, a little bit over corner even. So I would be looking at edge rusher, someone like Jarrell Taylor from Tennessee that has quickness, can stand up and rush off the edge, can put his hand in the dirt, but is really going to win with that first step ability. And then I would look at corner with that, I believe pick 79, that 4th pick, where you could get someone like a Cameron Dantzler from Mississippi State, who I don't believe he gave up a touchdown in the last 3 years in the SEC, and definitely has the size to hold up on the edge.
Matt, thanks so much for joining us, and stay safe out there.
Likewise, you guys stay safe and good luck with this draft.
Always great to hear from Matt Miller. You can follow him on Twitter, like we said, at NFL Draft Scout. EA, we mentioned it in the interview here and there that Matt Miller had a 7-round mock draft, and just real quick wanted to get your take on it. At least the first 3 rounds, he has the Jets going Mekhi Becton at 11, Penn State wide receiver KJ Hamler in the second round, Michigan edge Josh Uche, and then Florida State cornerback Stanford Samuel III.
Tackle, receiver, edge, then cornerback. Those are the 4 needs that we've been talking about. So on paper, that makes sense. Becton Greens might have the highest ceiling of any offensive lineman in this draft. He seems like a Joe Douglas type player, tenacious, a guy who's tough. He wants to get after you, smack you in the face. 364 pounds. Played the left tackle most recently. I wonder what he projects on the Jets draft board in terms of which side they'd like him to play on. But, just listening to Becton and hearing people talk about him, he seems like a Douglas type. He loves football, loves getting after you, wants to get dirty, and he wants to impose his will on you.
KJ Hamler, somebody that didn't run at the combine, but he probably a sub 4.4 guy. So he's got speed for days. He's a little light and short. He weighed in at 5'9", 178. I think he's really like a gadget player. I think he can line up out wide. Obviously, I don't think he's winning 50-50 balls, but I think he might be one of those guys where his game is he gets open, and once he has the ball in his hands, he can take a 3-yard slant and take it the distance, or take a 15-yard in and get 20 yards after the catch. KJ Hamler could be that guy. However, I don't think he's that guy where Sam Darnold could just throw it up and hope for the best. He's not that type of player, but he's really electric with the ball in his hand. So I think it'll be interesting just to see the profile of receiver that Joe Douglas and Adam Gase and Sean Jefferson and Hines Ward are looking for. That was another edition of the Official Jets podcast, powered by Amazon Web Services. EA, thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, buddy.